The most important ingredient personally that I have benefited from, Amit, is to be insanely curious about how people react to what you say and how you say it. Most presenters, whether it is a visual presentation, it's a verbal presentation, we will just spit out what we have to say and never care about how it was received. And that is, to me, the fallacy of a poor storyteller, because all they care about is something that I strongly believe in: output versus outcome. Your output was say what you had to say. Your outcome is make it received the way you wanted it to be received.
Welcome to Prime Venture Partners Podcast, a podcast for entrepreneurs looking to build and grow their startups. Learn about uncommon strategies and common traps from makers and doers of startup ecosystem.
Welcome to the Prime Venture Partners Podcast. Today we have with us a special guest, Ankur Warikoo. Many of you probably follow him on various channels on social media, but he has an interesting title and one that I slightly helped him make up. So he's an entrepreneur in his own residence, both for his business and professional life, as well as for his personal life. We'll talk about both today. On the personal side, how he reinvents himself every few years, and obviously he's fairly well known for being the co-founder and CEO of Nearbuy. Welcome to the show, Ankur.
Thanks so much, Amit. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm going to be super selfish and steal this from you and make it into my own description. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
Great, Ankur. So lots of things we could talk about. And in fact, I was struggling with, what are the kinds of things that we should pick your brain on, right? Because you're pretty prolific on social media. You're a, entrepreneur who's tried several things before, etc. But I've sort of narrowed down into a couple of things, which I want to focus on in this podcast. The first one is storytelling and the importance of storytelling for everyone, right? It could be for founders, professionals, or even just socially. So can you talk a little bit, because I see you as an amazing storyteller, right? And can you talk a little bit about what storytelling means to you and how you've sort of, cultivated it either consciously or unconsciously?
Sure. And that's a terrific question. Thanks for setting that up, Amit. So for me personally, storytelling is perhaps the most important part of a founder's journey, because they are storytelling not just to their consumers, to their investors, but also to their employees, and more importantly, to their own self. And here's where I see a big difference in what the world perceives as storytelling and what I see it. Most of the world would think storytelling is about being on social media, shipping out videos, being as a public speaker, getting your interests aligned in gathering a crowd and rallying the crowds together and making them beat their chests and go rah, rah, rah. But for me, storytelling is an immensely personal journey. It starts with the fact that you have something that you passionately believe in. Think that you are better equipped to share that with all the emotions, with every sensibility that you have drawn upon your experience until now. And there is an audience, however small, that you feel will appreciate that story to come from you. So in the case of, say, a graphic designer, the storytelling needn't be even verbal. It will be 100% visual, where whatever is it that they create through their graphics, whether on an app or as an illustration or a sketch, becomes their story. And they communicate with individuals who align with that storytelling method, whichever way they find fit, and he or she then builds an audience through that. If it's an actor, then their storytelling is as much the dialogue that they render, as much as the body language that they also speak with and go about doing their work. So I feel that storytelling has many different facets. I have been very blessed, Amit, that I got introduced to public speaking rather early in my life. I was a very shy, introverted kid back in school. I still am an introvert at heart. But what I gathered courage over several years, now almost 2 decades in the making, was to make myself comfortable on stage and to be able to impromptu create a story that aligns and embraces the emotions and the sensibilities of whosoever is listening. And I always, whenever I'm on stage, I find myself nervous, but I also find myself in that zone where, and Naval Ravikant put it beautifully, and there cannot be any podcast without the mention of Naval Ravikant. But he put it very beautifully, saying the best public speakers are the ones who are never speaking to the audience, but speaking to themselves. And that is true for me. I find that my storytelling approach has gotten to a point where I use it as a tool to crystallize my own thoughts. You ask me a question, anyone else asks me a question, I ask myself a question, and then I go into that storytelling mode where I weave my words together to form a structure. And the more I do it, the more concrete I become in my thoughts, the more conviction I have in my beliefs. And that's how I've used it. And I've seen that as a founder work immaculately well when you are hiring for talent. Nearbuy got a lot of positive vibes built from the storytelling approach that we all adopted, and I was the face of. We saw that happen extremely well internally when we were going through tough times, and the entire approach of connecting with the audience emotionally, psychologically, socially in a way that they rarely encounter helped us navigate through those tough times. And I think personally, it's helped me build this community, this following, which thrives on awareness and thrives on the fact that there is just so much to know, so much to uncover in our lives, that we should always be a student. And they look at me, thankfully and very graciously, as someone who's an ambassador for that approach in life, which is awareness is almost everything. So long story short, for me, storytelling is one, very personal, two, very contextual, depending on the story that you want to share, the kind of individual you are, the audiences that you speak to. And it needn't be verbal. It needn't be to a large community always. It needn't even be socially or publicly. It could very well be private in the way that you do it. And third, if you become a great storyteller, it just helps you crystallize your own thoughts, your own beliefs in ways that very few things can.
Very interesting. Lots to unpack there. Let me pull on a couple of threads. So often people say, and I know you write also quite a bit, that writing is thinking through the fingers, right? And people write to think more clearly. And you're saying, look, I speak and share and create content to help sort of clarify my own thoughts and kind of build it for my own self and my own audience. But in particular, you use the term emotion quite a bit, right? And I want to sort of double click on that and also think about, at least in the Indian startup ecosystem, are people uncomfortable to share stories because we tend to come from a much more left-brain kind of school of thought, right? As opposed to being more emotional, more vulnerable, and so forth. So can you talk a little bit about the role of emotions in storytelling and being able to connect with the audience? And, if you may extrapolate, because I know you mentor a lot of entrepreneurs and offer courses on this, why is that? And how can one overcome that?
That's a great point to make. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Amit. It's, in my belief and in my experience, it's true that most of the boundaries and the inhibitions around storytelling, particularly in India, are driven by the lack of comfort around being vulnerable, the lack of comfort around displaying your emotions, because most of the entrepreneurs, unfortunately, I would say so, in India, are engineers. Most of them are male, and their training, for no fault of theirs, has been around the fact that everything is bits and bytes, that everything is 0 and 1, that there's nothing like a continuum. Either you know it or you don't. Either the machine works or doesn't. And when you go to the other end of the spectrum, which is streams of humanities, where psychology, philosophy, history, geography is learned, you realize that for them, the world is a continuum. It's always gray. It's never black and white. So they are far more comfortable, but they're not the ones who at least we see as yet starting up and building businesses. And that's why you would see stark differences. Like Kunal Shah is a great friend, and how he thinks and how he operates is so dramatically different from most others, because he recognizes what it is to deep dive into the inner psychology of how consumers behave, how people react, how humans are structured. And I think that is a very important part to storytelling. One is, of course, the fact that you have stories. And I refuse to believe that there is anyone in the world who doesn't have stories. I think where they lack is the conviction that those stories are important to anyone else. And that's only because when they narrate those stories, they narrate it with the objectivity that they think is necessary, but not with the emotional connection that is required for the story to seep in. As much as we would like to believe, humans don't think in numbers. We think in stories. You go back as all of us when we were kids, all that we encountered, the way we understood our life and the world around us was through stories. Whether it was stories that we read in books, whether it was stories that were narrated to us by our parents, our grandparents, everything is centered around storytelling. And mankind is the species that indulges in storytelling as a pastime, as something that we do, whether it's gossip in the form of what we may call not so positive storytelling, to all the stories that we see in pop culture, whether it's music or it's films or it's art. So we as a species react very favorably towards stories, but as our training and our education system and our societal upbringing has taught us, hide your emotions. If you display your emotions, someone will get the better of you. You will be projected as the weak one. You'll be projected as someone who's gullible. You'll be projected as someone who could be crushed. And that's why we stop. Men are encouraged not to cry. Men are encouraged not to display emotions, so on. And
yeah. So actually, how should one overcome this, right? So because we like we were saying, right? We like to spit out, data or facts, or here's what my product does. Here's what the customer says, as opposed to weaving into a story. One part is the emotional part and being vulnerable. The other is just letting the data also tell a story. Like you said, a graphic designer, their art or their visual design tell a story. So is there a way one can nurture this? Have you seen that as you've taught classes or mentored entrepreneurs and so forth?
I think the most important ingredient personally that I have benefited from, Amit, is to be insanely curious about how people react to what you say and how you say it. Most presenters, whether it is a visual presentation, it's a verbal presentation, we will just spit out what we have to say and never care about how it was received. And that is, to me, the fallacy of a poor storyteller, because all they care about is something that I strongly believe in: output versus outcome. Your output was say what you had to say. Your outcome is make it received the way you wanted it to be received. So the things that have helped me specifically and practically are: one, always seeking feedback on what you've shared, how you've shared it. Feedback with the genuine curiosity of learning, not defending, not trying to project or even rationalize how you did what you did and why you did what you did, but just simply listen, not with the intent of reacting, but understanding. That's number one. And it's funny how many times I would get on stage in front of a large audience, whether it's a large corporate or very smart individuals, and I'll feel like I know nothing. And I'll step out of the stage and I'll ask them, how did I do? And unfortunately, when you get to this position, most of them are like, oh, you were great, you were awesome, because you are at that position where they don't want to rub you off the wrong way. But you have to be persistent around, no, I felt that this was not right, and this is where I fumbled, and this is where it didn't come across. How did you understand it? Like, what was the emotion that was generated when I said this? What did you take away from that? So on. And at least in my experience, I've uncovered a lot. So that's number one. The second thing that I've done, which has been fascinatingly helpful, is I record my own voice almost daily, and not with the intent of making it into a podcast or sharing it with anyone. I record it so that at some point of time in the future, I can hear it back. And when I do, I try and document what are the emotions that I felt and what is it that I wanted to express at that point of time, and what is it that I actually felt when I heard it. After some time, when I've forgotten the context, I've forgotten how I was feeling that day, and so on. And it's amazing how much or at least personally me, I gather from this experience. Because here's one thing: we very rarely get to hear our own selves as a third-party individual. We're always hearing ourselves through our ears, inside our head. We don't hear ourselves as a third party. When you do, that's for the first time you realize that your voice has a lot of depth that you had completely ignored all this while. And two, you will also begin to uncover that the way you speak, and if you could see a body language, let's say you're recording a video, you would realize how your eyes shape up, how your lips shape up, how your cheeks move, to give you a sense of, oh, this is what I meant. This is how it was projected. And if you do that, just spending time with yourself, hearing yourself or watching yourself, if you have that ability, then it helps tremendously. At least before the lockdown, I stay in Faridabad. Work was in Gurgaon. Used to travel every day. And that's when I would just speak to myself. I literally would, like a diary, record myself and just leave it there. And it would just have the timestamp. And at some point of time in the future, a month or 2 months later, I would just randomly open up one of those files and hear it back. And it would just immensely, immensely help. The third thing is what you shared right in the beginning of this question itself, which is writing. And I feel to be a great storyteller, it really helps if you write. And if you're not a writer, then it really helps if you read. If you're neither, then it becomes really hard. Because if you write and you write consistently as a discipline, and you then begin to share it because you're comfortable sharing it, first with your near ones, then eventually with a larger crowd, and you then ask them the same questions that I would ask when I get off the stage, which is, how did I do? How did you perceive this? What did you understand from it? It helps you a lot. And to get to that point, it's helped me tremendously to read from people who are great storytellers. Like, you can really make out the difference between a bad book and a good one, and the difference between a good book and a great one. And the great ones are the ones that you keep reading, and no matter how many times you read, you just uncover something new, a new way of that same story, a new way of how it's done. And I resist, and this is the last point I'm going to make, I resist the urge to fall in the trap of reading intellectual stuff. And when I say intellectual, I don't mean it as a dismissive thing. I mean, it is far more important for me to understand the art of storytelling through the book than to be enamored or be in love with the content specifically. Those are different books. But I read books just to understand the art of storytelling. And in that context, I would not hesitate reading a Chetan Bhagat. I would not hesitate reading pop culture books, which most people would say are not the best examples of writing, but for me, a great example for storytelling. I would pick up a book where I may not learn anything as a concept, but I would learn a lot from storytelling. So these three things: seeking feedback and being super curious around how did your words or your art or whatever is it that you share connect with the audience that you share it with. 2, documenting in a disciplined fashion your words, maybe your writing, your facial features, expressions, and looking at them at a point in the distant future where you then ask yourself the same question that you would have asked someone else: how did I do? And 3rd, writing and reading as a discipline to understand what the fine art of storytelling is and to get better at it, hopefully, eventually.
Fascinating. So I've also kind of used to do this recording thing to get rid of these verbal tics like, yes. I said, and that was like the easiest way. But you've given me a new nuance on that I can listen to that voice to understand, voice projection, emotion, try to see what is that voice trying to express. That's an interesting takeaway for me personally. But switching gears, let's talk about entrepreneurs and building your own personal brand. Of course, if you're a founder of a company or even a senior leader, there is some affiliation where you have with the company's brand, right? Because you are the company or you're one of the creators of the company. But I think it's really, really important for the founders to also build their own personal brand, right? On social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and so forth. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about that part of the journey, both for you and for others. You have a large following on social media, right? How did you build it? What works, what doesn't? How should one go about telling a good story about oneself, right? As a professional CEO or a co-founder of a company.
So let me start with saying that I personally don't think that it is very important for all founders to have a personal brand. I think it's more important for them to recognize that they are naturally inept at it and that they can do a good job of it if they were to devote a slightly dedicated time towards it and be very clear of what the objective is. So let me explain what I mean by that. When we started Nearbuy in 2015, actually it started slightly earlier in 2013 itself, we realized that we were running a company that couldn't afford to pay top dollars for talent. We genuinely believed in the culture that we had built, and we felt that that was a very progressive, very healthy culture for great talent to flourish. It was very conducive for people to grow personally and professionally. And we felt that we were always at the mercy of media or people outside of our control to share that story. So if we raised funds, people were like, hey, they raised money. And if we didn't, then people were like, oh, they're not doing anything. And frankly, it felt very frustrating and disappointing that everything that was spoken about was just limited to how well you were doing as a fundraising machine, not necessarily as a business. And definitely no one cared about how good a place it was to work or whether it is a great place that people could consider. So back in 2013, we decided that we would want to take charge around that. And we said, we want to be the owner of our own story. We don't want anyone to have any say in the story that we have to share with our audience, because why should they? And why should anyone act as a mediator or even as a middleman? So what we began to do is spend time on platforms where we felt the talent that we wanted was spending time. And that was beyond just time that they were spending seeking jobs, because it wasn't about LinkedIn back then. It was about where do the smartest engineers, where do the smartest tech people spend their time? What is it that they're doing? And back in 2013, Quora was a really big platform for such people. India was surprisingly and unexplainably one of the top countries for Quora. And I began spending a lot of time on Quora, answering questions about literally anything. What is it to work at Nearbuy? Why does the product suck? Why are they doing this? Why are they not big enough? Who are the competitors? Why are they good? Why is this bad? Two things around my personal life, like what car does Ankur Warikoo drive? And I don't know why people were interested in that. How much salary does Ankur Warikoo get? What's the net worth of Ankur Warikoo? What's the love life of Ankur Warikoo? And I was like, look, if people want to know, then I am the owner of that story. If I feel comfortable sharing it, then I'll just share it. And we began sharing. And in that journey of 2013 to 2015, there was just so much traction that we got from Quora. And here's a data point that I've shared earlier, and I'm going to share on non-podcast itself. In these 2 years, Amit, we received more than 12,000 applications directly or indirectly because of our content that we produced on Quora. These were people who applied for internships. These were people who applied for jobs. There were people who applied just randomly saying, we love how open you are, how transparent you are, how comfortable you are with your mistakes, with your imperfections. I'd love to be in this place. Is there an opening? And so on and so forth. And then in 2015, when we became Nearbuy, we were very clear that this is what we wanted to do as a planned strategy for the company. And I was more than happy to be the face of it. Storytelling came naturally to me. I was comfortable in front of the camera, in the media. I felt that as the founder and the CEO, I would be the best representative of what we stood for and how. So we started then taking that notch up, and LinkedIn became that platform. We started with text, then very quickly videos. I distinctly remember in 2016, LinkedIn launched videos, and I waited and waited for that product to roll out on my profile. Didn't happen. And then one fine day on a Wednesday, I was like, screw it, let me just write a post. And I tagged Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn back then. And I was like, hey, Jeff, what does it take for the video feature to be enabled on my profile? And within an hour, I had a response from a product manager of LinkedIn saying, we've enabled it for you. Like, seriously? That's all that it took? Like, I waited for 3 months, and all that it took was just a post. And that then got the first video out, which was, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. And it happened to be a Wednesday. And in just a random moment of creativity, if you will, I called it Warikoo Wednesdays. And that was the first episode of Warikoo Wednesdays. And every Wednesday since then, a video has come out. Now, of course, a lot more. But those 4 years of just content building on LinkedIn just changed the game for us. We never had to work with any external agency for hiring. We till date have a 2-people team for hiring, and that's all that there is. All of our hiring is done organically, whether inbound or through referrals. And I'd like to believe that almost all of it is credited to the fact that we build that story up. And to the question that you asked right in the beginning, the reason I say that it's not important for every founder to have a personal brand is because it doesn't work if you are not doing it out of will. If you're not doing it because you enjoy it, you're doing it because you think you should be doing it. Worse off, you're doing it because you see other founders doing it. That's almost always the worst reason. It's like going back to entrepreneurship and saying, hey, why did you start up? Well, I started up because my friends were starting up. Wrong reason. I started up because I wanted to make money. Wrong reason. I started up because I was super distressed and uncomfortable in my current job. Wrong reason. The right reason to start up is because you have a problem that you are so driven by that you would love to dedicate your time and your money and your life to it without necessarily attaching any outcome to it, because most likely the odds are against you. And that's the same for storytelling as well. You do it not because everyone else is doing it. You do it because it comes naturally to you. You're good at it. You want to do it, and it brings you joy. It's not a strain. It's not like a drag. It's not like, oh shit, today is the day to post a video. Come on. It was like last week, 7 days already gone. That's not the mindset that will make it work, because sooner than later you'll just give up. And that's the truth. Like I tweeted about this about 2 months back. Everyone in the pandemic is creating content. Like literally everyone. सबके podcast हैं, सबके newsletter हैं, सबके सब कुछ हो चुका है. And I said, it doesn't matter who's creating content right now. What matters is who will still be creating content a year from now. And the truth is 90% of all the content creators right now will not be creating content a year from now. They won't be. It's just hard. It's insane discipline. It's almost like running another parallel life to the one that you already have. And that's why you should only do it if there are the right reasons behind it. You're very clear on the objective and you enjoy it.
Absolutely. So there is one thing which is the objective, and I completely agree with you. And a very interesting point about, if you're doing it against your will or because your board member said so or your recruiter or your head of HR said so, it's probably not going to work because you have no passion and commitment and conviction of doing that, right? So you might even do a couple of blog posts or something, and then you kind of fritter away. But on the flip side, there's also an element of skill and also an element of the initial inertia to get over, right? I didn't know how to write at all in the sense of writing on a platform. And I met a journalist at some otherwise boring party, and he taught me, or he told me about this skill called free writing. And I said, what the heck? Let me use this free writing concept just to learn what it is and do a blog post or two. And then boom, my first blog post got some 10,000 views. And this is like 2015, 2016. I'm like, oh, okay, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I can know how to write. So how do you develop the skills? How do you get over that initial inertia, right? Assuming that your objectives are aligned and you're doing it for the right reason.
The simple answer to that, Amit, is we overthink what people will get out of this. Here's what I mean by that. Someone like you, and you look at your journey, it's fascinating. You have been in really large companies. You saw Make My Trip go through such fantastic success. Now you're running your own thing and you're an accomplished investor. It's very easy that on a daily basis, you tell yourself, Amit, whatever is it that I know is just so common knowledge that it's not worth sharing. Like, kaun befu hoga jisko ye nahi pata? What's the point of even stating the obvious? What's the point of even stating and indulging in platitude? What's the point of saying, you know what, you should start up only if you are completely driven by the problem statement and you are okay with it never making you any money. Like, everybody knows that. Of course, everybody knows that. So what's the point of stating it? But here's the thing that I have realized. Humans are just so comfortable at getting comfortable. The worst thing about us as a species is that we completely forget what it was to be us in the past. I don't have any very strong recollection of how I was back in my 20s. All I remember was I was lost, I was ambitious, but I didn't necessarily have a plan and so on. And I feel people of their 20s today are way smarter. They know a lot more, they're a lot more aware, they have the internet and so on and so forth. So we always resist sharing because we feel that whatever we have to share is not good enough, is not going to help someone, is not going to get the attention that we think it should get, knowing very well in our head that it is not important or something which is just the obvious. And I think the biggest thing that helps in getting over the inertia is reminding yourself there's something that you know that someone else who's living your life doesn't. And if you share that, you're only helping them. There's something that you know that someone who's not living your life doesn't know. And if you share it, you're only helping them. Every single time you refuse to share what is on your mind, what is something that you've learned from your experience, something that you encountered today that you felt you navigated well, or maybe you didn't navigate well, but you learned something the hard way through it. Every single time you think that that is not good enough to share, you are allowing shitty content to come out and become popular or become the standard. Every single time smart individual resists the urge to share their art, shitty art goes out and becomes the new normal of the standard of art. And that's why I'd say just completely eliminate, as hard as it is, the notion in your head that what I have to share is not helpful for anyone else. It is helpful. You just have to find who it is for.
Absolutely. I think aligning the objective with what you uniquely know and can share is very, very interesting. Now, there's a flip side to all this sharing and storytelling, brand building, etc. That, like you said, even some of the stuff that you answered on Quora, there's a lot of time that goes into it. There's a lot of energy. There's also all the trolling and other sort of stigma. Right? People saying, boss, tum kuch kar nahi rahe ho kya? The whole time you're on LinkedIn, or right? The whole time you're on Twitter, or the whole time you're on Quora, or what have you. How do you deal with some of that? And, any thoughts on that, of the toll it takes?
It is hard, Amit. And it's hard because it's not just true for storytelling. It's true for anything else that you would do, which people think is a distraction. The world believes that everyone should be doing one thing at a time. I don't believe in that. And that's why any individual who thinks the same way, that they could be doing other things, will always be looked down upon. Forget storytelling. If you want to spend time with your kids as an entrepreneur, people will look down upon you. And it's like, boss, ye kya kar rahe ho? You have to dedicate your life towards entrepreneurship. That's the only way it will work. And why do you have a life? Why do you have a family? Why do you have anything that you go back to? You should be sleeping in office. So it's not just true for storytelling. It's true for literally anything that you do, which the world thinks you shouldn't be doing. And the only answer, which almost everyone knows already, is you've got to have your priorities right. You know why you're doing it, hand on heart. You're always aware of this being the right reason for me to do it. This is the important thing for me to do. And if that is the case, then you will have to find ways of fighting for it, or it will be important enough for you that you will not need you will not feel the need to rationalize it or defend it. But it is going to be hard because the world will not give away any excuse for pulling you down.
Absolutely. And I can't but end, even though we're running a little short on time, on, you recently posted your failure resume on LinkedIn, and I think it went absolutely mentally viral, right? So maybe we can end with that. How should one think about dealing with failure? Especially it's kind of not looked upon well by society, personally, professionally, etc. So any thoughts on that as we wrap up here, Ankur?
I think everyone should have the failure resume. It's not important for them to share it, but it is very, very, very important for them to create one, because that's the only way you reflect upon it. Here's bad advice. Bad advice is, to succeed, you need to fail. That is true, but that's not the entire picture, because everyone in the world fails, but not everyone succeeds. So it's not failure alone that will get you to succeed. It is failure plus reflecting upon that failure that will hopefully get you to succeed. And the failure resume does that. It allows you to reflect, literally pause and think about everything that you've done in life, wherever you failed. Resist the urge to insert any success in it. Resist the urge to say, oh, I didn't make it to the IITs, but I made it to a good college. No, there is no but. You didn't make it to the IITs. That's the failure. Reflect upon it. Reflect upon who you were, why it happened, what could you learn from it, and so on. So my only guidance and passing thought would be, everyone should have a failure resume. It doesn't need to be public. You need to be okay with that and comfortable, but building one will make you reflect upon your failures, and that's the first step towards you learning something from them.
Wonderful. Ankur, I'm certainly going to do mine. I haven't done one yet, but I will write my failure resume first for myself, and then perhaps post it out there. But thank you so much. Really engaging, thoughtful, and authentic, I think, which is why it's pretty clear to me, as well as perhaps the listeners of this podcast, as to why you have such a great following. So we wish you all the best. Be an entrepreneur in your residence, and look forward to continuing sort of great content from you. Thanks, Ankur.
Thank you so much, Amit. Thanks for the thoughtful questions, and thanks for being a wonderful host.
Dear Listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners Podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.